The French Wars of Religion is the name of a period of civil infighting and military operations, primarily fought between French Catholics and Protestants. The conflict involved the factional disputes between the aristocratic houses of France, such as the House of Bourbon and House of Guise, and both sides received assistance from foreign sources. The exact number of wars and their respective dates are the subject of continued debate by historians. Some assert that the Edict of Nantes in 1598 concluded the wars, although a resurgence of rebellious activity following this leads some to believe the Peace of Alais in 1629 is the actual conclusion. However, the Massacre of Vassy in 1562 is agreed to begin the Wars of Religion, and the Edict of Nantes at least ended this series of conflicts. During this time, complex diplomatic negotiations and agreements of peace were followed by renewed conflict and power struggles. Between 2 million and 4 million people were killed as a result of war, famine and disease, and at the conclusion of the conflict in 1598, Huguenots were granted substantial rights and freedoms by the Edict of Nantes, though it did not end hostility towards them. The wars weakened the authority of the monarchy, already fragile under the rule of Francis II and then Charles IX, though it later reaffirmed its role under Henry IV. Background: introduction of reform ideas. The Renaissance in France. Humanism, until the late 1520s, served as a breeding ground for the French Protestant Reformation. The spirit of the Renaissance interested Francis I. He encouraged the study of the classics by establishing royal professorships in Paris, equipping more people with the knowledge necessary to understand the classics. Francis I had no qualms with the established religious order, and did not support Reformation. Through the Concordat of Bologna, Pope Leo X increased the power of the king over the church. Nomination of clergy depended upon the king's choice and taxes were levied upon the church. In France, unlike in Germany, the nobles supported the policies and the status quo of their time. The establishment of the Royal College and the spread of the printing press served the purposes of the Reformation. The printing press made mass production of books inexpensive and fueled the spread of knowledge in all disciplines. Interest in the classics, sword and literature was made available to a wider audience. The accessibility coupled with romanticism for the knowledge from the past that built empires and civilizations brought about the value for understanding literary works from the original. Precise language and eloquence were valued among scholars, and true understanding of the classics meant studying them from the originals. This inevitably led to the reading, study and translation of the early Church Fathers and the New Testament from their original without relying on commentaries from the medieval period. The printing press also facilitated the spread of information across borders. Theological and religious thoughts were disseminated in an unprecedented pace. Ideas about the Reformation were widespread in France by 1519. John Froben, a humanist printer, published a collection of Luther's works. In one correspondence, he reported that 600 copies of such works were being shipped to France and Spain and were sold in Paris. The humanist perspective on understanding scriptures had theological and ecclesiastical implications. Studying scriptures in the original flourished in the Renaissance period. Scholars, who approached theology from this humanist perspective, argued that exegesis of scripture must be coupled with understanding the Greek language used in writing the New Testament and later the Hebrew language for the Old Testament. This contrasted the heavy reliance of the medieval church on the Vulgate, the Latin translation of the Bible. The Meaux Circle was formed by a group of humanists including Jacques Lefebvre d'Etaples and Guillaume Briçonnet, Bishop of Meaux, in the effort to reform preaching and religious life. The Meaux Circle was joined by Vatable, a Hebraist, and Guillaume Budé, the classicist and librarian to the king. Lefebvre's works such as the Fivefold Psalter and his commentary on the Epistle to the Romans were humanist in its approach. They put emphasis on the literal interpretation of Scripture and highlighted Christ. Lefebvre's approach to the scriptures influenced Luther's methodology on biblical interpretation. Luther would later use his works in developing his lectures that contained ideas that would spark the greater part of the Reformation known as Lutheranism. William Farel also became part of the Mo circle. He was the leading minister of Geneva who invited Calvin to serve there. They were later exiled out of Geneva because they opposed governmental intrusion upon church administration. But their eventual return to Switzerland was followed by major developments in the Reformation that would later grow into Calvinism. Marguerite of Navarre, the sister of King Francis I, also became part of the circle. Corruption of the established religious system. Corruption among the clergy showed the need for reform, and Lutheran ideas made impressions of such hope. Criticisms from the population played a part in spreading anti-clerical sentiments, such as the publication Heptameron by Marguerite, a collection of stories that depicted immorality among the clergy. Furthermore, the reduction of salvation to a business scheme based on good works for sale system added to the injury. Under these circumstances, salvation by grace through faith in Jesus was a pleasant alternative. Works such as Farel's translation of the Lord's Prayer, the True and Perfect Prayer with Lutheran ideas, became popular among the masses. It focused on the biblical basis of faith as a free gift of God, salvation by faith alone, and importance of understanding and prayer. It also contained criticisms against the clergy of their neglect that hampered growth of true faith. Growth of Calvinism. Protestant ideas were first introduced to France during the reign of Francis I in the form of Lutheranism. The teachings of Martin Luther, and circulated unimpeded for more than a year around Paris. Although Francis firmly opposed heresy, the difficulty was initially in recognizing what constituted it. Catholic doctrine and definition of Orthodox belief was unclear. Francis I tried to steer a middle course in the developing religious schism in France. Despite this, in January 1535, Catholic authorities decided that those classified as Lutherans were actually Zwinglians, followers of Huldrych Zwingli. The lower orders of society was where Protestantism made its impact in France. However, Calvinism, a form of Protestant religion, was introduced by John Calvin, who was born in Noyon, Picardy in 1509, and had fled France in 1536 after the affair of the Placards. Calvinism in particular appears to have developed with large support from the nobility. It is believed to have started with Louis Bourbon, Prince of Condé, who while returning home to France from a military campaign, passed through Geneva, Switzerland, and heard a sermon by a Calvinist preacher. Later, Louis Bourbon would become a major figure among the Huguenots of France. In 1560, Jeanne d'Albret, Queen Regnant of Navarre, converted to Calvinism possibly due to the influence of Theodore de Beza. She later married Antoine de Bourbon, and their son Henry of Navarre would be a leader among the Huguenots. Affair of the Placards. Francis I continued his policy of seeking a middle course in the religious rift in France until an incident called the Affair of the Placards. The Affair of the Placards began in 1534, started with protesters putting up anti-Catholic posters. The posters were not Lutheran but were Zwinglian or sacramentarian in the extreme nature of the anti-Catholic content, specifically the absolute rejection of the Catholic doctrine of real presence. Protestantism became identified as a religion of rebels, helping the Catholic Church to more easily define Protestantism as heresy. In the wake of the posters, the French monarchy took a harder stand against the protesters. Francis I had been severely criticized for his initial tolerance towards Protestants, but now was encouraged to repress them. At the same time, Francis I was working on a policy of alliance with the Ottoman Empire. The ambassadors in the 1534 Ottoman embassy to France accompanied Francis I to Paris. They attended the execution by burning at the stake of those caught for the Affair of the Placards, on the 21st of January 1535, in front of the Cathedral of Notre-Dame de Paris. John Calvin, a Frenchman, escaped from the persecution to Bâle, Switzerland, where he published the Institutes of the Christian Religion in 1536. In the same year, he visited Geneva, but was forced out for trying to reform the church. When he returned by invitation in 1541, he wrote the Ecclesiastical Ordinances, the constitution for a Genevan church, which was passed by the Council of Geneva. Massacre of Maryland. The Massacre of Maryland took place in 1545. Francis I ordered the punishment of the Waldensians of the city of Maryland, who were affiliated with Protestantism, for dissident religious activities. Historians estimate that Provençal troops killed hundreds to thousands of residents there, and in the 22 to 28 nearby villages they destroyed. They captured hundreds of men and sent them to labor in the French galleys. King Francis I died on March 31, 1547, and was succeeded to the throne by his son Henry II. Henry II continued the harsh religious policy that his father had followed during the last years of his reign. Indeed, Henry II was even more severe against the Protestants than Francis I had been. Henry II sincerely believed that the Protestants were heretics. On June 27, 1551, Henry II issued the Edict of Chateaubriand, which sharply curtailed Protestant rights to worship, assemble, or even to discuss religion at work, in the fields, or over a meal. In the 1550s, the establishment of the Geneva Church provided leadership to the disorganized French Calvinist Church. The 1540s had seen an intensification in the French fight against heresy, which meant Protestants gathered secretly to worship. But by the middle of the century, the adherents to Protestantism in France had increased markedly in number and power, as the nobility in particular converted to Calvinism. Historians estimate that in the 1560s, more than half of the nobility were Calvinist, and 1,200–1,250 Calvinist churches had been established. By 1562, with the outbreak of war, there were 2 million Calvinists. The conversion of the nobility constituted a substantial threat to the monarchy. Calvinism proved attractive to people from across the social hierarchy and occupational divides. It was highly regionalized, with no coherent pattern of geographical spread. Rise of factionism. The accidental death of Henry II in 1559 created a political vacuum that encouraged the rise of factions, eager to grasp power. Francis II of France, at this point only 15 years old, was weak and lacked the qualities that allowed his predecessors to impose their will on the leading noblemen at court. However, the House of Guise, having an advantage in the king's wife, Mary, Queen of Scots, who was their niece, moved quickly to exploit the situation at the expense of their rivals, the House of Montmorency. Within days of the king's accession, the English ambassador reported that the House of Guise rules and doth all about the French king. The Amboy's conspiracy, or tumult of Amboys. On March 10, 1560, a group of disaffected nobles attempted to abduct the young Francis II and eliminate the Guise faction. Their plans were discovered before they could succeed, and the government executed hundreds of suspected plotters. The Guise brothers suspected Louis I de Bourbon, Prince de Condé, of leading the plot. He was arrested but eventually freed for lack of evidence, adding to the tensions of the period. Iconoclasm and civic disturbances. The first instances of Protestant iconoclasm, the destruction of images and statues in Catholic churches, occurred in Rouen and La Rochelle in 1560. The following year, mobs carried out iconoclasm in more than 20 cities and towns. Catholic urban groups attacked Protestants in bloody reprisals in Sens, Cahors, Carcassonne, Tours and other cities. Death of Francis II. On December 5, 1560, Francis II died, and his mother Catherine de' Medici became regent for her second son, Charles IX. Inexperienced and faced with the legacy of debt from the Habsburg-Valois conflict, Catherine felt that she had to steer the throne carefully between the powerful and conflicting interests that surrounded it, embodied by the powerful aristocrats who led essentially private armies. She was intent on preserving the independence of the throne. Although she was a sincere Roman Catholic, she was prepared to deal favorably with the Huguenot House of Bourbon in order to have a counterweight against the overmighty Guise. She nominated a moderate chancellor, Michel de l'Hôpital, who urged a number of measures providing for civic peace so that a religious resolution could be sought by a sacred council. Colloquy of Poissy and the Edict of Saint-Germain. The regent Queen Mother Catherine de' Medici had three courses of action open to her in solving the religious crisis in France. First, she might revert to persecution of the Huguenots. This, however, had been tried and had failed. Witness the fact that the Huguenots were now more numerous than they had ever been before. Secondly, Catherine could win over the Huguenots. This, though, might lead directly to civil war. Thirdly, Catherine might try to heal the religious division in the country by means of a national council or colloquy on the topic. Catherine chose the third course to pursue. Thus, a national council of clergy gathered on the banks of the Seine River in the town of Poissy in July of 1561. The council had been formed in 1560 during the Estates General of Saint-Germain-en-Laye when the Council of Prelates accepted the Crown's request to give Huguenots a hearing. The Protestants were represented by 12 ministers and 20 laymen, led by Théodore de Bèze. Neither group sought toleration of Protestants, but wanted to reach some form of concord for the basis of a new unity. The council debated the religious issue at Poissy all summer. Meanwhile, a meeting between Bèze and the Cardinal of Lorraine, of the House of Guise, seemed promising. Both appeared ready to compromise on the form of worship. The King of Navarre and the Prince of Condé petitioned the regent for the young King Charles IX, the Queen Mother Catherine de' Medici for the free exercise of religion. In July of 1561, the Parliament passed and the regent signed the July Edict, which recognized Roman Catholicism as the state religion but forbade any and all injuries or injustices against the citizens of France on the basis of religion. However, despite this measure, by the end of the colloquy in Poissy in October 1561, it was clear that the divide between Catholic and Protestant ideas was already too wide. In early 1562, the Regency government attempted to quell escalating disorder in the provinces, which had been encouraged by factional feuds at court, by instituting the Edict of Saint-Germain, also known as the Edict of January. The legislation made concessions to the Huguenots to dissuade them from rebelling. It allowed them to worship publicly outside of towns and privately inside them. On March 1, however, a faction of the Guise family's retainers attacked a Calvinist service in Oisy-sur-Blaise in Champagne, massacring the worshippers and most of the residents of the town. The Huguenot Jean de La Fontaine described the events. The Protestants were engaged in prayer outside the walls, in conformity with the king's edict. When the Duke of Guise approached, some of his suite insulted the worshippers, and from insults they proceeded to blows, and the Duke himself was accidentally wounded in the cheek.